Hello and welcome to Historia Romana. Episode 12. Anthropology of Pre-Roman Italy. Prior to this episode, we've been mostly relying on the ancient literary sources to tell us the origins of Rome. But as listeners have likely already noticed, there are several limitations with this. Beyond the several inclusions of the supernatural, there are huge blank spots in our knowledge, with entire centuries of people and events being summed up with a sentence or two, and often incorrectly at that, thus straying somewhat outside the field of history into the field of anthropology. The next 3 episodes will be dedicated to re-evaluating what we've been told by the ancient writers and see just how much they got wrong, as well as what little they may have gotten right. Today, we will primarily focus on the origins of the Latins that were discussed back in episodes 1 through 3. As a brief recap of what the ancient sources tell us, the first recorded people in Italy were the Oenotrians, who were originally Arcadian Greeks who migrated to southern Italy around 1700 BC. They later mingled with migrating Pelasgians to form a new culture in central Italy known as the Aborigines. These Aborigines were later infused with Trojan blood after Aeneas led his people to Italy around 1200 BC, forming the tribe we now call the Latins. These Latins were centered around the city of Alba Longa, and it was from their royal Silvian dynasty that Romulus would one day spring forth to create Rome. As alluded back in the Act 1 introduction, however, the blunt truth is that basically none of this is actually true. The stories of these early peoples were likely just that. Stories made up by storytellers to fill the gaps they didn't know about their distant past and which later writers chose to accept as fact in lack of any other hard evidence. Most of these figures were drawn from Greek mythology. Hercules, or Heracles as he was originally called by the Greeks, is the most blatant example, with his 12 labors that took him across the Mediterranean, providing an ample opportunity to throw in a side story involving Italy. Aeneas was a minor character of Homer's Iliad, and stories of him escaping to the west were already popular with Greek mythographers by the time the Latins adopted him as their forefather. Even minor characters like Oenotrus, Evander, and Latinus had their origins in earlier Greek legend, even if the details of their lives conflicted with the later Roman accounts. This is not meant to invalidate these stories as worthless, as several of these mythical figures went on to become important icons in Roman culture. We know from archaeology, for example, that divine honors were awarded to both Hercules and Aeneas since at least the 6th century BC, very early in Roman history. However, a historian's job requires them to go further than just accepting the stories we are told at face value, and so while the details will be broad, the rest of this episode will focus on what modern anthropologists have learned about pre-Roman Italy. Based on skeleton fragments found in the caves of Liguria, modern humans have lived in Italy since at least 46,000 BC, near the end of the last ice age. These first settlers, the so-called Paleo-Europeans, would have been hunter-gatherers, or people who lived off of what the land could naturally provide, always on the move to find more animals and plants to eat. The first major innovation to life in Italy came around 6000 BC with the Neolithic Revolution, when travelers from the Aegean and the Near East taught the native inhabitants strategies to grow crops and domesticate animals. For the first time, humans would now be able to supply food for themselves in perpetuity, allowing them to stay in one place and create permanent structures. Furthermore, now that not every individual in each family was needed to acquire food, these societies could diversify with new occupations like potters, merchants, tailors, and priests. That said, the mountainous terrain of Italy limited the amount of farmland that could sustain crops, and so what space was available was generally reserved for herding cattle, goats, and pigs, who only required grass. As animal herding requires the herd to move around every so often to let the grass regrow, whatever structures these early people built were usually quite small, settlements that could be built quickly and abandoned when needed. Around 3700 BC, these early inhabitants also began experimenting with metalworking, making their first metal tools out of copper. Meanwhile, far to the east of Italy on the Pontic steppe, or what is now Ukraine, were a group of people we call the Yamnaya culture. The Yamnaya were still a nomadic society, led by a warrior aristocracy who were able to continually subjugate their neighboring tribes, likely thanks to a brand new innovation, the domestication of the horse, which allowed them to travel at much faster speeds. These people shared, if not a common ethnic identity, then at least a common language, Proto-Indo-European or PIE. One branch of these PIE speakers went east into Central Asia, where their spoken tongue would later develop into the Iranian and Indian languages. Around 3300 BC, the other branch began to move west into the Balkans, where in time their language would later birth most of the modern European language families: Hellenic, Illyrian, Baltic, Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, and most importantly for us, Italic. The Indo-Europeans either displaced or absorbed the Paleo-Europeans wherever they went. The first wave of Indo-European migration into Italy began around 2500 BC, whereafter several tribes began to put down roots and adapt to a sedentary lifestyle. A few centuries later, we begin to find archaeological remains for the first two Indo-European cultures in Italy. The first was the Terramare culture, which takes its name from the black earth residue of their settlement mounds, located along the numerous rivers of the Po Valley in northern Italy. These villages, which now featured wooden walls for the first time, were much bigger than anything previously seen in Italy, with the largest estimated to house 2,000 people. They not only practiced crop farming, growing wheat, beans, and flax, but were the first people in Italy to produce bronze, a metal alloy made from copper and tin, which proved to be much more sturdy than normal copper. To the Terramare's south was the Apennine culture, who continued to live as semi-nomadic herdsmen, grazing their animals over the meadows and groves of mountainous central Italy. Their range was not necessarily confined to the mountains, as their pottery has been found among the Seven Hills in Rome, but they otherwise left behind much fewer remnants than the Terramare. Around 1200 BC, around the time Aeneas was supposed to have fled Troy, another wave of Indo-Europeans, the Proto-Italic speakers, moved into the peninsula and brought both of the pre-existing cultures to an end. These Italic speakers formed a new culture which spread across the entire Italian peninsula, but whose settlements were most numerous in the future site of the Villanovan culture, hence why we call these earlier people the Proto-Villanovans. These people brought the sedentary lifestyle of the Terramare culture further south into former Apennine territory, but their villages were generally smaller, and they featured a much more rounded mix of crop farming, animal herding, and hunting. They were also the first known people in Italy to practice cremation, or the burning of dead bodies to ash and storing the remains in urns. This practice would be continued by almost all of the later Italic peoples. Beginning around 1000 BC, the Proto-Villanovan culture appears to have undergone regionalization, or the splitting up into multiple smaller cultures. The most prominent of these were, naturally, the Villanovans, centered in modern Tuscany, which we will discuss more next time. The earliest people who we can conclusively call Latins, or Latials as they are known in anthropology, began to appear south of the Tiber River around 900 BC. The Silvian dynasty, or the descendants of Ascanius, who ruled from Alba Longa, were almost certainly fake, with specific kings being inserted into the records to either explain certain questions, like how Tiberinus Silvius was the namesake of the Tiber River, serve as stand-ins for later famous Romans, like Agrippa, Silvius being a clear nod to Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man, or simply build up the pedigree of the Latins by extending their history back to the Trojan War. In truth, the Latins continued to live as the Proto-Villanovans had before them, concentrated in small, independent villages scattered amongst the hills, practicing a mix of farming and herding. Settlements like Laurentum, Lavinium, and Alba Longa, if they even existed at all, would have been unremarkable towns with no special power over the other Latin villages, nor would they have been more than a century or two older than Rome itself. However, the Latins stand out from the rest of the Italic cultures for two reasons. First, they were among the only Italic tribes which did not continue the practice of cremation, instead returning back to the traditional practice of inhumation, or burying their dead. Secondly, the early Latins spoke a language we today call Latino-Faliscan, in recognition of the related Faliscan tribes who lived north of the Tiber, which, while Italic in origin, was very distinct from the wider Osco-Umbrian dialects that came to dominate the rest of Italy. This language began to be written down around 600 BC, using an early version of the alphabet that has since become ubiquitous around the world. By that point, the Latins had begun to urbanize, developing proper cities and importing ideas from their more powerful neighbors, primarily the Etruscans and the recently arrived Greeks. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time.